So period 4 of AP US history is looking at what's essentially the antebellum period, or the period prior to the Civil War. It's essentially the early 1800s from about 1800 to 1848. We'll kind of play with those that end date there a little bit and maybe edge into the 1850s a little. So first, the antebellum era, or period 4, really begins with the election of Thomas Jefferson in the Revolution of 1800. Here, Jefferson's victory, along with the victory of the Democratic Republicans, marked the end of the Federalist era, and it was also considered to be a revolution because the incumbent party, or the Federalist Party that was already in power, peacefully gave up power and gave up their offices to Democratic Republicans that were elected, meaning that this American experiment could succeed and we could create a viable, sustainable government. The key tenets of Jeffersonian democracy mean major changes for the U.S. government. Jefferson believed that the yeoman farmer, or the small independent farmer, best exemplified the democratic virtue and independence of American ideals. He also held that the federal government should not violate state rights, and in pursuit of this, the scope and activities of the federal government were greatly reduced only to what was specifically permitted by the Constitution under Jefferson's administration. A major development during Jefferson's presidency was the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. This originated with Jefferson's desire to acquire the port of New Orleans, but he found that he was offered the entire Louisiana territory for purchase. He did purchase the Louisiana territory, but it violated his strict constructionism of adhering only to what the Constitution said. But Jefferson violated this principle in his hopes to create an agrarian republic of all or mostly small yeoman independent farmers. And he believed that a lot of land was needed to make that happen. As a result, the Louisiana Purchase was America's largest peaceful acquisition of territory in our history, and it was explored by Lewis and Clark's Corps of Discovery that was chartered by the U.S. government to, commissioned by the U.S. government to explore and map the region. During Jefferson's presidency, although Jeffersonian democracy, or his view of the role and size and scope of government, said that the government should be smaller, the Marshall Court, or the Supreme Court under Chief Justice John Marshall, believed in a strong central government. And in that way, we have one branch of government that's actually working more in the Federalist model than it is the Democratic-Republican model. And the Marshall Court, or the Supreme Court under Chief Justice John Marshall, consistently ruled in ways that strengthened the federal government. And a really good example of this is a court case in 1803 called Marbury v. Madison. Here, John Adams, on his way out of office, had appointed several Federalist judges so that the courts would be filled with Federalists even after they had a Democratic-Republican president with Jefferson. When Jefferson came into office, though, he refused to allow them to take office. They refused to allow them to be officially appointed as judges. The case goes to court, and the court overrules part of this Judiciary Act of 1789 that would have appointed these judges. But the important takeaway here is that by overruling this law, the case established the principle of judicial review, or the right of the courts, especially the Supreme Court, to declare laws unconstitutional. In doing so, it made the federal government more powerful by expanding the power of the federal courts. Marshall's court was also generally opposed to the idea of states' rights, and under Marshall, the Supreme Court upheld the supremacy of federal law over state law. The Marshall Court also promoted the growth of business enterprises by ruling for less state regulation on economic activity. Famously, in the case McCulloch v. Maryland, the court struck down a Maryland law that would have taxed the Baltimore branch of the National Bank. In doing so, it strengthened the financial and economic powers of the national government over the state governments. The next major development in the antebellum era is the War of 1812, which was caused by British impressment of American sailors, war hawks' desire to annex Canadian land, the interference of the British with our commerce by interfering with our trade and impressing American sailors, and British aid to Native Americans in the Ohio River Valley and in Western territories that were resisting American settlement there. The war can be said to have been won by the United States, although if you really look at it, it was kind of a draw. Either way, many Americans believed that they had in fact won the War of 1812. And the consequences, therefore, is that the war contributes to the demise of the Federalist Party, who had generally opposed the war. That led to accusations of a lack of patriotism, a loss of support, and as a result, we enter the so-called era of good feelings, when even though there are two parties, really the only one ever getting elected are the Democratic Republicans. And as a result, there is broad consensus on national policy during this period. The victory, so-called in the War of 1812, also intensified nationalist feelings or loyalty to the country as a whole rather than to an individual state or region of the country. It also promoted industrialization, as many northern states had to invest heavily in manufacturing because they weren't able to trade, which their economies used to be based on. And finally, it advanced the career of Andrew Jackson, who led an American victory, really the biggest American victory in the war, at the Battle of New Orleans. And that's going to advance his political career to ultimately lead him to be elected president. In the meantime, though, we have the so-called era of good feelings, which is typically associated with the presidency of James Monroe. Again, the demise of the Federalist Party left the Democratic Republicans in control of Congress and the presidency, and as a result, there's sort of broad consensus on national policy. And part of those things is, or part of that is Henry Clay's American System, which was an economic plan put forth by the Kentucky congressman, which invested in transportation, instituted a high or protective tariff on foreign goods, established a second Bank of the United States, and generally benefited the North more than it did the South. And as a result, the era of good feelings is going to be shattered partly by debates over Clay's American System. Ultimately, though, it's going to be the presidency of Andrew Jackson that is going to split this era of good feelings again into two political parties, this time being the Democrats and the Whigs. Another controversy during the era of good feelings, which was threatening to derail this broad national consensus, were debates over the expansion of slavery, none of which was bigger at this time than the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Missouri wanted to enter the Union as a slave state, but that would upset the balance in the Senate between slave and free states, which led to the first national debate over slavery and its expansion. Ultimately, the Missouri Crisis is settled by the Missouri Compromise, in which Missouri entered the Union as a slave state, but that balance was maintained by allowing Maine to enter as a free state. And the remaining territory of the Louisiana Purchase would be divided along the so-called Missouri Compromise line on the southern border of Missouri. Anything south of that line would be open to form as a slave state once they incorporated as states. Anything north of that line slavery would be prohibited there once they incorporated into actual states. A development during the era of good feelings that helps to promote nationalism or a feeling of kind of national pride and unity was something called, or a foreign policy referred to as the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. This was a declaration of American principles that asserted the United States was independent from Europe in terms of foreign policy. It kind of assumed that the political system in the Western Hemisphere was fundamentally different from that of Europe, and it warned European nations against trying to recolonize parts of the Americas, and it promised in exchange that the United States would not interfere in the affairs of Europe. And this is going to set a pretty important precedent where the United States effectively sees the Western Hemisphere as its sphere of influence and will take it upon itself throughout really the rest of the 1800s to pretty consistently get involved in the affairs of other nations in the Western Hemisphere. Like I said earlier, the era of good feelings is pretty much shattered during Jackson's administration as president. But Jackson was elected on the idea that he better represented the common man. Jackson's followers or his supporters had great respect for the values and abilities of the common man, and Jackson was portrayed as a kind of advocate for the interests of ordinary citizens and as an opponent of Eastern moneyed interests, especially bankers in the Second Bank of the United States. And Jackson and his followers, called Democrats, benefited greatly from expanded white male suffrage in the early 1800s as more and more so-called common people were able to vote, and that was the set that Jackson and Jacksonian democracy appealed directly to. Another key tenet of Jacksonian democracy was the idea of patronage or the spoils system. This is a policy of placing one's political supporters in office, even if they had no experience and might have been incapable of performing the job. Nonetheless, it reflected the belief that political supporters of a candidate should be rewarded with government jobs once that individual has been elected. Another tenet was opposition to privileged elites. Again, as a portrayed champion of the common man, Jackson despised the special privileges of the Eastern elite, especially banks and bankers, and Jackson actively worked against these interests during his administration. Jackson's presidency sees a number of constitutional crises, one of which was the nullification crisis, which begins with the passage really of the Tariff of Abominations, so-called, in 1828. So we've already established that the Northeast benefited from protective tariffs such as those that were implemented with Henry Clay's American system. But such tariffs were unpopular in the South, which had few manufacturers. A tariff in 1828 was so high that it earned the name from Southerners, the Tariff of Abominations, and led Jackson's vice president, John C. Calhoun, to resign and to formulate his doctrine of nullification. The doctrine of nullification drew heavily on states' rights arguments that had previously been advanced by Jefferson and Madison in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, as well as the Federalist Hartford Convention during the War of 1812. But the argument here is that a state could refuse to obey a federal law or an act of Congress if it considered it to be unconstitutional. So Calhoun led South Carolina to effectively nullify these tariffs and threatened to secede from the Union. Jackson opposed South Carolina's nullification efforts and threatened military actions through the use of the Force Act if these tariffs were not collected. Ultimately, though, a compromise is reached, and this constitutional crisis is thus delayed, at least for the time being. Next, we have Jackson's Bank War. Jackson vigorously opposed the Second Bank of the United States, and he will actually veto the bill to recharter the bank, alleging that it represented individuals who had special privileges rather than representing the interests of the common man. The consequence of this is that Jackson vetoes the recharter, meaning that the bank is now on a sort of limited lifespan, and Jackson's going to begin removing federal deposits from the Bank of the United States to small local favored banks, which are so-called pet banks because they are run or favored by his supporters. This is going to cause an expansion of credit or lending and speculation by these mostly unregulated state banks. And it's going to help lead to the financial panic of 1837 and the emergence of the Whig Party, which opposed Jackson and supported Clay's American system, part of which was the Second Bank of the United States. Finally, we have Jackson's forced removal of Native American tribes from the American South. States had been removing Native American tribes in the South despite the existence of federal treaties that should have protected their rights to the land. One tribe in particular, the Cherokee, took their case to court to resist their removal, and that's the case in 1831, Worcester v. Georgia. The Cherokee actually win their case, and the Supreme Court upheld the rights of the Cherokee to their tribal lands. But Jackson, who was president at the time, was well known as an enemy of Native Americans, and he refused to recognize the court's decision in Worcester, allegedly saying that Chief Justice John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. Jackson's refusal to enforce Worcester v. Georgia's decision resulted in the removal of the Cherokee to settlements west of the Mississippi River along the so-called Trail of Tears. And approximately 1/4 of all of the Cherokee died along the Trail of Tears as a result of Jackson's refusal to enforce the law, or excuse me, the ruling. Next, in the antebellum period, we get to a series of economic changes during the market revolution. And one of those changes involved in that is the so-called transportation revolution, which led to the advent of new modes of transportation, new infrastructure, and so on. One example is the Erie Canal in New York, which was completed in 1825 and was so successful that it sparked a period of canal building across the country. This was helped along by the advent of steamboats that came into wide use in the 1820s and 1830s, but canals and steamships themselves will even be replaced by more efficient means of travel in the form of railroads by the 1850s. The consequences of this transportation revolution was that the Erie Canal, for instance, strengthened ties between New York City and the Great Lakes region. Canals and railroads helped to open the West to settlement and trade. Steamboats dramatically increased river traffic, and these developments mostly benefited the North and the Northeast. It had the least effect on the South, which grew increasingly independent of the Northeast and the West as not only separate culturally, but very separate economically. Next, we have dramatic westward expansion during the 1840s. And this really kind of begins a little bit prior to that with the fight for Texan independence in the 1830s. Led by Stephen Austin, thousands of Americans had migrated to Texas at the invitation of the Mexican government, who wanted to settle and develop the region. But Mexican laws outlawing slavery and requiring settlers to convert to Catholicism helped to antagonize these settlers, who ultimately declared their independence from the Mexican government, but were overwhelmed by Mexican forces at the Battle of the Alamo in San Antonio. However, Mexican General Santa Anna eventually surrendered to Texans at the Battle of San Jacinto, and they established the so-called Lone Star Republic, which is effectively Texas as an independent nation that doesn't enter the United States as a state until 1845, when it's finally annexed under the administration of James K. Polk. And this era of expansion is driven primarily by this idea of manifest destiny. This is an idea, or really, excuse me, a term coined by a newspaper editor named John O'Sullivan in 1845 that suggested the United States had a God-given right or a God-given obligation to expand westward all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and in doing so bring the, quote-unquote benefits of white civilization to non-white people living there. And this idea of manifest destiny was used to gain support for westward expansion. And that included, like I say, annexing Texas under the administration of James K. Polk. And several presidents, a few presidents, including Andrew Jackson, opposed the annexation of Texas for years, fearing that that it would lead to a debate over the expansion of slavery. Ultimately, like I say, Texas was annexed in 1845 because Americans were divided over admitting another, Texas wouldn't be annexed until 1845 because Americans were so divided over this issue of admitting another slave state. But Polk is also responsible for absorbing Oregon into the Union. During his campaign, he had used the slogan 54-40 or fight as a kind of promise to take all of Oregon territory, which was jointly shared between the United States and Britain. But the U.S. and Britain ultimately reached a compromise to establish a boundary at the 49th parallel rather than all the way north at the 54th parallel. But the major land grab during Polk's administration is the Mexican-American War, which lasted from 1846 to 1848. Polk justified the war, claiming that Mexican troops had shed American blood upon the American soil after Polk had ordered federal troops into disputed territory of Texas. During the war, Whigs opposed it as a Democratic land grab to benefit slaveholders, and some notable opponents included Henry David Thoreau, who penned On Civil Disobedience, and Abraham Lincoln, who introduced the spot resolutions in Congress. The war is ultimately ended by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which gave the United States the Mexican cession, which included California and much of the modern-day American Southwest. Once this happens, though, and here we're kind of bleeding into period 5 a bit, a resolution is introduced in Congress called the Wilmot Proviso, and it called for the prohibition of slavery in the Mexican cession. It was never passed into law, but it led to an enormous debate over how we should expand slavery into the Mexican cession if we are to expand it at all. And it really signals the major fights over the expansion of slavery that are going to come in the 1850s that are ultimately going to lead to the Civil War. A couple of other cultural things to mention before we wrap up. We have transcendentalism and utopian communities. Both of these are kind of reactions to the rapid social and economic changes of the market revolution. Transcendentalism was a philosophical and literary movement that emphasized living a simple life while at the same time celebrating truth found in nature, emotion, and imagination. It called for people to be very individual in the sense that they separated themselves from mainstream society to go live in nature and not get caught up in the kind of rat race of the market revolution. Leading writers in the Transcendentalist movement were Henry David Thoreau, who we mentioned earlier, as well as Ralph Waldo Emerson. Similarly, we have the rise of utopian communities. Utopians believed in this idea of perfectionism, which was the belief that humans could have a better life through conscious acts of will. And they would form these separate communities that tried to escape the competitiveness of American life during the market revolution. They'd also tried to regulate moral behavior and create cooperative lifestyles. The best-known communities, or utopian communities, were Brook Farm, New Harmony, and the Oneida community. The antebellum era was also an era of religious and social reform. First, we have the Second Great Awakening, which was a series of religious revivals, somewhat similar to the First Great Awakening during the colonial period. It played a really important role in making Americans aware of the moral issues posed by slavery, and thus helped to spur abolitionist reforms and other reforms. Some of those reform movements during the antebellum era included the asylum movement led by Dorothea Dix, who raised awareness about the mistreatment of those in mental institutions. Another is the movement to establish public schools led by Horace Mann, who pushed for universal public education in the states. You also had the temperance movement, which attempted to reduce the amount of alcohol that people consumed, seeing alcohol consumption as the root of crime and poverty. And finally, abolitionists advocated that slavery be abolished. In terms of women's roles in antebellum society, their lives were still governed by that cult of domesticity or Republican motherhood ideal. Women weren't allowed to vote, serve on juries, or perform any other civic task, and really had no legal identity apart from their husbands. As wives and mothers, they were expected to raise their children to be moral, virtuous citizens of the new American Republic. Women were, however, among the first factory workers during the market revolution as America industrialized. So in the early 1800s, textile mills in Lowell, Massachusetts relied heavily on a labor force of young unmarried women, oftentimes referred to as the Lowell girls. These Lowell girls and this workforce of mostly women and children were replaced mostly by Irish immigrants just prior to the Civil War. Women's roles were also changing during antebellum America in the sense that they were leading a women's movement and were very heavily involved in many of these reform movements mentioned earlier. So the women's movement was obviously led by middle-class women who promoted a broad-based platform of legal and educational rights, and oftentimes had very close links with the abolitionist movements and temperance movements. The major milestone in the women's rights movement, though, is the Seneca Falls Convention, which was held in 1848. It was organized and led by two abolitionist reformers named Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, and it issued the Declaration of Sentiments, which was closely modeled on the Declaration of Independence. It called for the right for women to vote, the right to retain property after marriage. It called for greater divorce and child custody rights, and also called for equal educational opportunities. And like I say, marks the beginning of the women's rights movement in America. So that covers everything really for the period 4 review here. Keep in mind this review is not comprehensive. It, of course, does not cover absolutely everything, but it does cover the main points that if you know these things well, you should have enough information to do well enough on the exam to pass. Obviously, the more you know, the better, but this is a good foundation to begin from.